Good morning, and welcome to this Wilson Center Africa Program event and webcast on an underappreciated tool, the role of traditional justice institutions in peacebuilding in Africa. I am Sherry Ayers, and I am the Communications Program Assistant with the Wilson Center's Africa Program. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Wilson Center, it was chartered by Congress in 1968 as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. The University of Pennsylvania's Global Go-To Think Tank Index report recently ranked the Wilson Center as one of the top 10 think tanks globally. The Wilson Center Africa program works to address the most critical issues facing Africa and U.S.-Africa relations, build mutually beneficial U.S.-Africa relations, and enhance knowledge and understanding about Africa in the United States. Today's event is held under the banner of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding. Established with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding is a continent-wide network of 22 African policy, research, and academic organizations that work with the Wilson Center's Africa program to build African knowledge and perspectives to the United States, African, and international policy on peacebuilding in Africa. One of the main components of the network is the Research Scholarship Program. Scholars from member organizations are hosted by the Africa program here in Washington, D.C. for a 3-month resident scholar program. The selected individuals complete a policy-oriented research project and engage with U.S. policymakers and practitioners. The scholars share their research findings while simultaneously building local context and knowledge into U.S. policy discussions. Today, SVNP, Mr. Awad Kashe, will share the results of his research project with us. For those of you joining us online, we are live tweeting today's event and taking questions on Twitter and via our website. To join the discussion, please tweet your questions and tag @AfricaUpClose with hashtag traditional justice and hashtag peace and justice, or use the chat function below of the current live stream on our website. We will also be holding one more SVNP Scholar webcast. On April 5th, we will present Refugee Women's Inclusion in Peace Agreements and Peacebuilding in Africa, Challenges and Opportunities with Ms. Sandra Tumwisije. Please see the Africa Program website for more details. I would now like to introduce Ms. Allison Grunder, the Associate Director and Senior Diplomatic Fellow of the Wilson Center Africa Program, who has set the stage for today's discussion and introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Sherry. So before introducing our speakers, I would like to take a minute to set the stage for our discussion on the role of traditional African justice institutions in peacebuilding. When examining ways to restore justice in post-conflict environments, there are a range of actors to consider and include in peacebuilding processes and justice mechanisms. Traditional African justice institutions, which reflect indigenous values and concepts of justice, are a crucial yet often underutilized and unappreciated tool in the peacebuilding toolbox, both for local, national, and international actors. The reconciliatory nature of traditional African justice institutions can make them ideal for facilitating local ownership, engaging key stakeholders, and building sustainable peace. Our speakers will analyze the challenges to restoring justice in post-conflict environments in Africa and elsewhere, consider the role of indigenous institutions in addressing such challenges, including a case study of the Gereb in Northeast Ethiopia, and offer key recommendations and lessons learned for how policymakers and practitioners can better engage with traditional justice institutions to contribute to sustainable peace in Africa. So with that said, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Catherine Lena Kelly. Dr. Kelly is Associate Professor of Justice and Rule of Law at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, a Department of Defense academic institution located at the National Defense University. Her work focuses on citizen security, party politics, and democratization, the rule of law, and Stabilization and Transnational Organized Crime. At the Africa Center, she is faculty lead for the executive level portfolios on countering transnational organized crime, as well as on rule of law and security sector governance. Dr. Kelly holds a PhD and MA in government from Harvard University, a graduate certificate in international politics from the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and a BA summa cum laude from Washington University in St. Louis. You can find her full bio on the website. I note that we are also privileged to be joined by our Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding scholar, Awit Kassé. Mr. Kassé is a Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding scholar and a PhD candidate in Peace and Security Studies at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University. He has been teaching law for more than 7 years in public universities in Ethiopia. His career interests are researching conflict, peace, and peacebuilding in Africa, with community-based knowledge to formulate sound policies on the continent and beyond. And then our final speaker will be Ms. Jana Ramsey. She's a contractor with Tuvli LLC and serves as Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Global Criminal Justice at the State Department. In this role, she focuses on developing U.S. policy on justice and accountability for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other serious violations of international law. She also works with policymakers, experts, and members of civil society on appropriate transitional justice responses to historic and ongoing conflict. She's a graduate of Wellesley College and Columbia Law School. All of these bios are available on our event webpage. So with that, I would like to ask everyone to join me in welcoming our speakers today. Of course, we have the virtual audience, and I'm imagining they're putting up the applause emoji. I would now like to ask Dr. Kelly to begin the panelists' presentations. We asked her to provide a perspective on the challenges to restoring justice in post-conflict environments and the role that traditional justice institutions can play. We're also hoping she can present some examples of peace-building efforts that incorporated traditional justice institutions successfully and what accounted for that success. On the other hand, what have been some important lessons learned in how traditional justice institutions can be more effectively used by African, U.S., and international partners to strengthen peace on the continent. So, Dr. Kelly, please.
Great. Well, let me start by talking about, I'll address the points in order. Let me start by talking about 3 challenges to restoring justice in post-conflict environments that traditional justice institutions can help with. First is that peace accords are often based on settlements among political elites. And so those are not necessarily always addressing all of the conflict-related concerns that the populace may have. So moving peace beyond the elite bargain can be really challenging, but traditional justice may be able to help with this. Second, after conflict, security sector institutions may be fragmented and politicized. There may have been security sector abuses of civilians during the conflict. There's often been massive displacement, humanitarian emergency, and other conflict-related injustices that need to be addressed. So given these many different issues, there are often, of course, competing policy priorities during transition, and justice issues are one set of issues, but not the only ones, of course. So there's often great need also for things like demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration, or DDR. There's need for security sector reform, SSR. There's need to reestablish the physical infrastructures of the state, and the need to provide public services of all sorts. So often things like DDR and SSR are needed to have subsequent justice sector reforms so that they stick. Yet the populace also has great need for immediate justice services during and after conflict. So the sequencing of security and justice reforms within state institutions isn't always corresponding to the timing and the degree of people's holistic justice needs. So again here, I think traditional justice may be able to fill some temporary gaps and then complement formal state court systems later on as well. Thirdly, there are a wide range of justice needs that people have during and after a conflict. So some are redress needs that directly relate to what happened during conflict, during violent periods. Others are redress needs that arise anew in everyday life after the conflict. So some of these are criminal issues, others are civil or administrative, and different mechanisms of justice may be more or less appropriate for different problems. And not all mechanisms are equally available, affordable, or close by to everybody involved. So sometimes having multiple options, say customary justice options, a statutory or formal court option, and others could be useful for citizens who are trying to solve problems. So I think traditional justice providers can potentially help to address all of these issues. They can sometimes play justice provision roles that states are not ready to play right after conflict. In rural areas, in many cases, they may be the sole reliable source of justice that's affordable and accessible to people and that's close by. And then even for people outside of rural areas in different African countries, there's a high degree of trust in chiefs and traditional authorities overall as keepers of the peace, as the Afrobarometer surveys have recently shown. So the AU Security Sector Reform Framework mentions traditional leaders. There's the 2019 African Union Transitional Justice Policy that recognizes their potential contributions in even greater detail. But too often, I think the more general international peacekeeping toolbox has focused perhaps more heavily than it could on maintaining these elite political settlements, which are key but not the only piece of the puzzle. There's also often a focus, which I know we'll talk about, on international justice provision, which is profoundly important, but often is focused on prosecuting some of the biggest violators of human rights in conflict, and so aren't contributing perhaps as much to ordinary citizens getting the redress that they too want to have after a conflict. So I think domestic state courts, international justice, but also traditional justice mechanisms can come into play here. In terms of examples, there's some examples I'd like to highlight of how peacebuilding interventions in Africa have successfully worked with traditional justice institutions. So first, traditional justice institutions have been used in peacebuilding to prevent additional conflict on the local level that could, if unaddressed, perhaps feed into national or regional conflict dynamics. And so I think one example that started in the mid-90s, Kenya's local peace committees have used traditional authorities like chiefs and elders to deal with issues that arise particularly in border communities with pastoralist issues, cattle rustling issues, livestock theft. And these are issues that can often spark violence on the local level, and there are risks of that sometimes percolating into something bigger. So the local peace committees have definitely employed traditional authorities in various ways to deal with this. Another example is that traditional justice institutions can help deal with transitional justice and reconciliation. So for example, in Sierra Leone, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was empowered by Sierra Leone's parliament to seek the input of customary authorities in doing some of its work. So the TRC then asked traditional authorities who administer their own forms of justice in certain parts of the country to engage in cleansing rituals, to oversee truth-telling processes, and to do things that supplemented and added to the other work the TRC was doing. So this brought traditional authorities into the process. There are some critics that argue that traditional authorities could have been brought in even more into this process, given the focused coverage of the special court in Sierra Leone, but this is a really positive example of how they have been brought into a process. Traditional justice institutions have also been engaged successfully by civil society in Africa in community-based and bottom-up grassroots initiatives for peacebuilding. So one example that strikes me as the West African Network for Peacebuilding has brought in traditional authorities into dialogue and mediation efforts that they're sponsoring and supporting amongst local stakeholders, including, again, on things like farmer-herder issues, these local level conflicts that can percolate in ways that affect post-conflict peace and security. And chiefs have also been part of WANEP's initiatives on countering violent extremism and on peace education programs where youth and elders are in concert doing some peace education and awareness raising together. Finally, traditional justice institutions have been especially helpful when the statutory court system in a country is under construction, has limited reach. So we've seen this in Somalia, for example. And there are alternative dispute resolutions in Somalia that have involved her. And this is an oral tradition memorized by clan elders for resolving conflicts. It's based on custom, and it's used within and across clans to resolve disputes, and also to try to reintegrate combatants. And so there are ADR mechanisms like this that have been important for resolving disputes, especially in rural areas, that contribute to peace building. I think in the Somali case, it was eventually in 2014, the Somali federal government formalized some HER procedures by creating alternative dispute resolution centers that are administered by the Ministry of Justice. So they're formalizing, to some extent, the administration of some of this form of justice that comes from traditional leaders and custom in different communities. This has also been used in peacebuilding committees in Somalia on the border with Kenya. So they've relied on some of these ADR centers to address some of the peacebuilding dynamics at stake. So I think my time is probably up. I'll end on a couple of lessons learned that I would humbly suggest in terms of how traditional justice institutions in peacebuilding could be better utilized. First, I think we can use traditional justice institutions in ways that are complementary to other justice and dispute resolution methods that are perhaps more likely to expand women, youth, casted people's equal involvement in peacebuilding. So generally, traditional justice providers bring a lot of valuable community-based knowledge to the peacebuilding table that other actors might not have. They have a cultural legitimacy to build trust with people in different ways than formal officials can, but they're also often, not always, but often patriarchal, elder-heavy institutions. And so those can be exclusionary to some constituencies that are also very critical for peacebuilding. So for this reason, I think traditional institutions are quite valuable, but should be part of one broader ecosystem of institutions that are working in concert to reestablish rule of law. And second, I think building further on legal empowerment approaches that integrate traditional justice options in different conflicts and post-conflict settings could be useful. So community-based legal empowerment focuses on supplying people, ordinary citizens, with information and resources that they need to choose the kind of justice that they want to pursue when they're facing particular problems. So it's helpful for them to have a choice across a range of justice forums and information about how each forum works and what the strengths and weaknesses are, whether those are state courts, customary justice institutions that aren't attached to the state. Sometimes customary institutions are also attached to the state, but that's a nuance that we can discuss maybe in the Q&A. There are other kinds of mediation available sometimes. So having a range of choices and knowing in terms of who you are, gender-wise, age-wise, where you come from, linguistic identity, religion, and otherwise. There may be different strengths and weaknesses of different justice options depending on who you are and where you are. And so building on that legal empowerment approach where people have these choices, I think, can make all of these different institutions work together maximally well. So I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. And now I will invite Mr. Kase to offer his insights by sharing some of his research on the case study of the Gereb in northeastern Ethiopia and his recommendations on the importance and the challenges of incorporating traditional justice institutions in peace-building approaches.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Thank you, Alison, and thank you, the Wilson Center, for giving me this chance to present my research. I think it's better to start by somehow introducing the context in the case study. So the case study or the traditional institutions are called Gereb traditional institutions. They are found in northeast part of Ethiopia along the boundary between the Afar regional state and Tigray regional state. These regional states are arranged based on the federal arrangements in Ethiopia. So the traditional institutions are working along the boundary between those two ethnic groups. So coming to the composition or the societal composition of the two ethnic groups, the Tigrayan ethnic groups are somehow followers of the Christianic religion, whereas the Afar communities are followers of the Islamic religion. The Tigrayans are somehow based on agriculture, their economy, which means, and the Afars are somehow pastoralists, even one of the major pastoral groups in the Horn of Africa. The Tigrayans are somehow the highlanders, whereas the Afars are somehow the lowlanders. So there is a kind of herder and farmer kind of relationship between those two communities. So Gereb traditional institutions are found along those two ethnic groups in Ethiopia. The conflict kind of dynamics there were some conflict in 2006, 1998, 1997, and 2006, 2005, which is somehow related to resources. As all of you know, the kind of conflict in the northeast part of Ethiopia is somehow related to farmer and herder kind of conflict, which is related to resources in relation to grazing land, in relation to water, in relation to some disputes in relation to demarcations of land. So This is the context. I am going to argue later that why traditional justice institutions needs to be included in peace buildings. So why should we include traditional justice institutions in peace buildings? In the literature, there is an inclination that traditional justice institutions need to be included in peace building because local ownership is a must. But I don't think that traditional justice institutions simply be included in peace building because local ownership is a must, or liberal peace or hybrid peace is not important, or there is a new dimension to cultural terms of peace building. Rather, I will argue that traditional justice institutions have their own specific and distinct nature that makes them compatible to be included in the peace building process in Africa. So the first point I want to make why traditional justice institutions should be included in peace building is that they are in a better position to understand the conflict, peace, and justice situations within the local communities. As all of you know, understanding how communities perceive conflict and peace is one important step to peace buildings. In order to, if you have policies on peace buildings, projects on peace buildings, the end goal of such kind of projects need to be building peace within the community understandings. So traditional justice institutions are in a better position to understand the conflict and peace, the cause of the conflict and how the conflict could be managed in such situation. For example, in the case study, a conflict between two individuals is not simply a conflict between the two individuals per se. It could have some ethnic kind of dimensions. As I told you earlier, those two ethnic groups are somehow different in terms of societal composition and different kinds of things. So this Gereb traditional institution or other kinds of similar kinds of traditional institutions are in a better position to understand the local context. That's the first point I want to make. Second, in terms of traditional justice, I didn't say transitional justice, I say traditional kinds of justice. They have their own, this local communities have their own kinds of sense of justice within the local kind of communities. I have tried to contact one of my respondents during the data gathering, told me that I simply asked him, why do you prefer traditional justice institutions than formal kinds of or state kind of justice institutions? I should read his statements here. He said that the state justice institutions only follow the offender, meaning the suspect. When they come to know that he is dead, the case also dead for them. Because the state justice institution does not consider the victim, does not consider the relative of the victim, or does not consider even the revenge or vengeance aspect of such kind of conflict. But these traditional justice institutions are able to consider the victim, or the relative, or the whole communities in the traditional kinds of justice systems. There are also other kinds of considerations in traditional justice, like, for example, material and non-material kind of values, like, for example, the slaughtering of animals could be one important aspect of the traditional justice. Reconciliation could also be another aspect of the traditional justice. Public participation could also be another important aspect of traditional justice institutions. These all are missed in the state institutions, particularly in the context background I given you in the introductory part. So traditional justice are in a better position still to understand the local context of justice within the communities. Another important point why traditional justice institutions should be considered in peace building. Usually the literature simply focused on the resolution aspect of traditional institutions. But I found out that traditional justice institutions has also prevention aspect. Prevention aspect in this sense means that traditional institutions have the capacity to prevent emergence of conflict. They have also the capacity to prevent escalations of conflict. They have also the capacity to prevent re-emergence of conflict. For example, in the case study, in relation to emergence of conflict, these traditional institutions have their own kinds of rules, which is enacted by the consensus of the two communities. In rules in relation to how to use and utilize the resource along the boundary between the two communities, which were a cause for a devastating conflict for so many kinds of years. So there are rules how to use the resources. There are also communication tools between the two communities in case when there is a kind of potential kind of conflict between the two communities, there is a means of communications established by these traditional kinds of institutions. In relation to, so they have the capacity to prevent emergence of conflict in such kind of situations. For such examples, for example, after 2006, there is no, devastating kind of conflict between the two communities after the Gereb traditional institutions granted a de facto kind of recognitions by the Tigray regional state and the Afar kind of regional state. There is no substantial kind of conflict between the two communities for almost 10 and above kinds of years. In relation to prevention of escalations of conflict, in case when conflict erupted, minor kind, as I told you earlier, in case when there is a conflict between two individuals, it could take an ethnic kind of dimensions. So what this Gereb traditional institution going to do in case when there is conflict erupted is that they will go to the victim directly, and there is an oath or a kind of promise system. They told the victim not to resort to a revenge until the case is settled down by the traditional justice institutions. So they will able to prevent escalations of conflict in such kind of situations. Lastly, in relation to prevention, traditional institutions have also the potential to prevent re-emergence of conflict. I have tried to compare cases that are settled down by in one of the districts in the Tigray regional state. I have tried to compare cases settled by the formal justice institutions and the traditional justice institutions. There is less probability to re-emerge if a case goes through traditional justice institutions and the state kinds of state institutions. But if the case is not settled down by the traditional means, simply by reconciliation, there is high probability to go to a revenge or vengeance or any other kinds of dimensions. So we'd have such kind. So what I want to make here is that traditional justice institutions have also prevention aspect, which is an important tool for peace buildings. So these are the 3 points I want to make. Of course, they have some detailed findings, but for the time being, these 3 points are important to consider. So what are the challenges in relation to traditional justice institutions? Of course, there are so many kinds of challenges, like, internal kinds of challenges, like the probably gender inclusions in traditional justice aspect. They are usually men are the leaders of the traditional justice institutions. There could be such could be a challenge as in the traditional justice institutions. There are also external kinds of challenges in such situations. For example, in Ethiopia, traditional justice institutions are not recognized legally, or there is no legal policy and institutional framework to recognize traditional institutions in Ethiopia. Of course, they have right to settle civil kinds of cases, but they are not part of the criminal justice system in Ethiopia. Of course, there are some good progress in Africa. For example, some countries have their own legal frameworks, policy frameworks, how to accommodate traditional justice institutions, but in some countries, this is also another challenge. Political intervention could also be another challenge for traditional justice institutions. For example, as I told you earlier, Gereb traditional institutions are functioning not by the constitutions of the country, not by any other kind of law, rather by the de facto recognition of the 2 states. So in case when there is a political difference between the 2 states, then this traditional justice institution could stop function. So political kind of intervention could be another important challenge to traditional justice institutions. There are also some limitations in terms of, as a traditional justice institutions can betterly understand the conflict situations in their localities, but they cannot simply prevent conflict beyond their locality. For example, as all of you know, there is a conflict, even a war in the northern part of Ethiopia states. traditional institution can't do or can't do nothing in such kind of conflicts because it is not within their location. So this could be another kind of challenges. Few recommendations in relation to traditional justice institutions. In the African Union and regional economic communities, we need to have a framework how to engage traditional justice institutions in conflict prevention. It is, I think, ECOWAS, which consider traditional justice institutions in its conflict prevention framework, which is, I think, enacted in 2008. Other regional economic communities does not include traditional justice institutions in the prevention frameworks. Dr. Kelly had tried to mention the traditional transitional justice framework in Africa, I mean in the African Union, but I would say that considering the numbers of traditional justice institutions in Africa, we need to have a separate traditional justice, not transitional, but traditional justice frameworks in Africa or regional economic kind of communities. So this is the first recommendation I want to make. Secondly, we all know that wars are ended by the elites, the signatures of the elites, or handshakes of the elites. But peace can only be sustained if traditional institutions are included at the grassroots level at least. So peace agreements, peace operations need to include traditional justice institutions in their contents clearly. Thirdly, which is somehow related to Ethiopia is planning to have a national dialogue, and even the law is already enacted. The national dialogue commissioners are already assigned. But still there is, ethnic tensions, intercommunal kinds of tensions, and within communities. So in parallel to the national dialogue, or at least before the national dialogue, we need to have community-based reconciliations in Ethiopia, which traditional institutions are able to do in the current situation. So these are some of the recommendations I have, and thank you.
Thank you so much. I really learned a lot from both presentations so far, and I'm expecting to learn even more from Ms. Ramsey's presentation. So please.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this event. It's a pleasure to talk about such an interesting topic. So in thinking about the challenges of restoring justice in a post-conflict environment, one that comes up over and over in Africa and across the world is the fragility of peace, and this sometimes fuzzy line between conflict and post-conflict periods. I mean, as the other panelists have said, resolution of conflicts or transitions from dictatorships is usually through a negotiated settlement between parties. So even if parties are negotiating in good faith, and that's a question, if the implementation of the agreement, if in the implementation of post-conflict reform is seen to be unbalanced or may threaten entrenched interests, there's always the looming threat that parties could pick up their weapons again, which is one reason why the debate over peace versus justice comes up so often in the context of peace negotiations. Sometimes leaders who are themselves implicated in atrocities will explicitly assert that that justice is a threat to peace, to try and push back on calls for accountability. So in 2016, the formerly warring leaders of South Sudan wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that said, pursuing criminal accountability would destabilize efforts to unite our nation by keeping alive anger and hatred among the people of South Sudan. It is easy to see how some people, having known nothing but war, may prefer to return to the battlefield than stand trial in a foreign country. Of course, it's necessary to find a way to address human rights violations and abuses for a stable and lasting peace. But what justice looks like has to take into account local reality. A second challenge is that in some contexts, the issue isn't as simple as restoring justice, but about trying to establish a measure of justice that may not have existed in the past or was not available for all members of society on an equal basis. In many countries where mass violence has broken out, the weakness in the rule of law may predate conflict. For example, the government may not have been able to exercise control over all parts of the state, or the judiciary may not be independent and free from influence. A government may also lack political will to tackle impunity for human rights abuses or corruption. Then you have conflict, which expands the crisis, multiplying the victims and perpetrators of atrocity crimes and creating a new array of complex legal problems. Finally, in a post-conflict period, government authorities are faced with political, economic, and humanitarian challenges on all fronts. There are humanitarian needs. People have been displaced internally and into neighboring countries. Communities have been destroyed and need to be rebuilt. Rebel groups may need to be demobilized and disarmed. The economy needs to be put back together and new governance structures formed. Perhaps elections need to occur. So prioritizing justice and accountability is hard in the context of those other immediate needs, especially because it can be resource intensive. So in the aftermath of conflict, trials for perpetrators alone may not satisfy the needs of victims or address the root causes of conflict. Instead, you need a full array of transitional justice mechanisms that facilitate truth-telling, reparations, institutional reform, and memorialization in addition to trials to better enable societies to address past harms and prevent their recurrence. So traditional justice mechanisms can fill in a gap left by the justice mechanisms such as the International Criminal Court or national statutory courts, which may not have the capacity to address all the violations and abuses that have occurred. They may also be able to fill needs that are not normally addressed in retributive court proceedings, offering more space for truth-telling or allowing for reparations and reconciliation in a culturally appropriate way. So when we talk about traditional justice or customary institutions, it's important to note that they take a wide variety of forms across the continent. But I'm going to take a look at South Sudan, where there's a lot written about customary courts, just as an example of how they might be useful and what some of the pitfalls might be. So in South Sudan, customary chief courts exist alongside statutory courts, filling in a much-needed legal gap where 90% of disputes in the country are settled. These courts predated colonialism. They're widely accessible to parties. They're able to resolve disputes relatively quickly. They're open to the public. They enjoy a high degree of legitimacy. And flexibility is particularly important where insecurity means there's like large movements of the population. So you have people that are often displaced. In a country where there have been significant ongoing violations, killings, widespread sexual violence, forced displacements that have touched every corner of the country, there's no plausible means to address justice through customary courts alone. At the same time, these are imperfect mechanisms, and there are significant weaknesses in customary courts when it comes to human rights issues. For example, a traditional remedy for homicide is the payment of cattle to the family of deceased. So that's a powerful restitution and reconciliation. But in some cases, a killer can avoid punishment by giving a woman or girl child to the family of the deceased, which is completely inconsistent with human rights norms. Similarly, in some areas, sexual violence is seen as a harm to a family or community and not to the victim, not to the individual victim herself. So customary laws regarding rape may require, for example, a victim to marry her rapist, or there's less value given to victims where it's an older woman or a married woman. And the kind of violence that can occur in conflict doesn't necessarily lend itself to traditional mechanisms. For example, when violence is intercommunal, so involving different ethnic groups, involves violence wielded by the state against individuals or communities, directly or through proxies, that can exceed the capacity of domestic mechanisms to deal with a problem. For those reasons, in reporting on the conflict in South Sudan, the African Union Commission of Inquiry reflected a pragmatic approach, acknowledging that customary courts can expand the reach of justice, but they need to incorporate human rights considerations into the dispensation of justice. So in terms of recommendations, the bottom line is how traditional justice measures can be used to address post-conflict issues. It's going to be very context-specific. That means thinking about what crimes were committed in the conflict, killings, displacement, sexual violence, and who are the perpetrators? Is this state forces, rebel groups? Were child soldiers involved? Was this intercommunal violence, or did perpetrators cross international borders? The other issue is, how do those most affected by violence want to see the harms against them addressed? What institutions do they trust? Do people want to see international trials? Do they want to see truth-telling? What would reparations look like? Are there crimes that they think would be best resolved through traditional mechanisms? Ultimately, transitional justice is not about checking a to-do list. Do you have courts, truth commissions, reparations, but about seeing what tools are best suited to redress a legacy of atrocities and promote long-term peace in a particular context. So to be successful, that means the measures have to be embraced as legitimate by victims and society as a whole. So a priority for the U.S. is supporting justice and rule of law to diminish the risk of violence before conflict begins. So our Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, for example, supports partner nations building fair, transparent, and accountable criminal justice systems. Before the outbreak of war in 2013, this bureau supported a survey of dispute resolution processes in rural South Sudan, which is very useful knowledge as discussions continue about what accountability should look like in the context of that conflict. We also support international organizations, the UN, UNDP, that provide valuable support to domestic institutions. Again, for example, in South Sudan, UNDP works with customary chiefs on the integration of international human rights principles, precisely the kind of work that the African Union identified as necessary. Finally, when conflict breaks out, the U.S. government provides direct support to civil society efforts to mobilize around transitional justice, efforts to document abuses and violations that can be used in future transitional justice efforts. So I would say, as a bottom line, the use of traditional justice measures to attain justice, reconciliation, and healing is no excuse for state inaction, and a government cannot shrug off its primary responsibility to protect its society and its responsibility to victims and survivors in society as a whole. And overall, what will work best is when transitional justice efforts, including traditional justice mechanisms, have the support of people and societies where they're functioning, rather than being donor-driven projects or mechanisms used by leaders who want to avoid accountability for their crimes. So I think I'll end that there.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much to all three of you. That was fascinating. And we already have a whole batch of questions from the audience, but I wanted to first ask whether you had any questions for each other.
I have one for Awit. Could you talk a little bit more about the Gereb traditional institutions? You had talked about communal conflict in 2006 as an example. I'm wondering, just getting a little more flavor of how these institutions have worked since then with prevention or with dispute resolution, as you mentioned.
Okay. Thank you. The traditional institutions, the Gereb traditional institutions, as I have tried to mention earlier, they compose of the two communities, representative of the two communities. For example, if there are 12 in numbers, then 6 of them are from the Afar ethnic group and 6 of them are from Tigray ethnic groups. So they work on resolving conflict if there is any kind of conflict. They are also somehow engaged in preventional kinds of activities by setting some rules on how to use the resources. They are also active in managing some kind of conflict. So the two governments, the Tigray regional government and the Afar regional government, give them a kind of de facto recognition simply because they have been experiencing a lot of conflict between the two communities, which will sometimes be devastating. So let's give them a chance how the traditional justice institution could able to manage such kinds of conflict. So it is a kind of lasting result for the two states to empower them to manage such kind of conflict. So they are engaged in prevention, somehow in managing of conflict, and also in resolving kind of conflict. So these are some of the things in relation to Gereb Institute. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from the panel to the panel? All right, then I'm going to offer our audience here in the auditorium the first chance at questions, and then I have a whole raft of questions from our online audience. Any questions from the audience? All right, then I will start with these online questions. So I'm going to read them three at a time, so you have a chance to think about them. So we have seen the impact of interpersonal relationships and dynamics between elite leaders in peace building, either for better or worse. How important are such interpersonal dynamics at the level of local justice institutions? And can these institutions avoid some of the pitfalls of elite leader disagreements? Question number one. Question number two, can you provide examples of successful collaboration between traditional justice institutions and international multilateral institutions? What worked well or poorly? And then number three, it was said that traditional justice institutions can be used to fill the gap in post-conflict governance and security institution rebuilding. Have there been examples of conflict between these traditional institutions and the government agencies after the restoration of the agencies? So who would like to tackle any of those questions?
Okay, thank you. Probably I would start from the last question in relation to conflict between the state institutions and the traditional justice institutions. So, for example, in the case of Ethiopia, I have tried to mention that there is no legal recognition, direct legal recognitions how traditional justice institutions need to work. So sometimes the recognition to the traditional justice institution simply given, if the state is somehow challenged to sustain peace within a specific kind of time, then they may give them such kind of power. But it's not the law that gives them such kind of power. So there is, conflict between those two traditional institutions in some areas. For example, sometimes traditional justice institutions may settle down suicide or some kinds of cases, but the state institution also want to settle similar kind of cases. So there is usual kind of conflict between those two institutions in Ethiopia because there is no clear demarcations on what the role of the traditional institution and what should be the role of state kind of institution. So conflict is somehow usual and inherent in the Ethiopian situations. I will come back to the other questions later.
Could I add on to what Mr. Kashe was saying? I guess this maybe addresses the first and the third questions to some extent. I mean, I think that there are interpersonal dynamics on the elite and on the local level, of course, in a variety of, security-related, conflict-related reconciliation processes and justice processes. And I guess, whether or not traditional justice institutions are formally recognized by the state, and there are many different ways, as you've pointed out, they could be recognized or brought in more formally into working with the statutory court system, for example, and we have many examples across the continent of many different configurations, I guess, that could result in. I think remembering that in certain, there are always politics of how these different institutions are working together. So I think there is a risk to some extent with certain forms of formalization that customary authorities who are highly regarded for their cultural legitimacy, for their knowledge of local communities, for their flexibility because they're working off of a customary basis for dispute resolution, if they get overly constrained by a centralized state that's trying to organize the justice system, there's also a risk on that other side of the spectrum that they'll be seen as political agents of the state. And so that also changes how maybe communities might see traditional justice authorities playing a different role than, say, the formal court system. So I think there's a risk on both ends of there being a really undefined space in which, there are risks of interpersonal dynamics getting in the way of peace settlements and maintaining the peace, but also of overly formalizing or overly constraining, perhaps, these institutions and their ability to have the flexibility and adaptability in their norms that might actually help them, as person who asked question one, do something a little bit different than the political elites. And so I was actually curious in terms of how you see this in Ethiopia and in terms of the Gereb institutions. It seems like there's a fine line between formalizing overly and formalizing just enough that you're defining people's roles in ways where they're working synergistically. But I think it's always political whether we're talking on the local level or the national one, regional one. I don't know what you think, but.
Yeah, for in relation to the Gereb institution, for example, the kind of government matters. For example, during the Derg regime, traditional institutions were seriously neglected, and it would not somehow difficult to involve in resolving kind of conflict because that regime considered them as, traditionalist and against the Marxist something ideology. So the kind of government, the kind of leaders in specific country could matter on how traditional justice institutions could work. For example, these days it is common to hear through in Ethiopian media that we'd have an excellent value, we'd have excellent kind of traditional institutions, kind of thinkings, but that might not be the case during the last kind of regime. So, of course, interpersonal kind of things matters for the good functions of traditional justice institutions. Still, Gereb traditional institutions are functioning as a last resort, not simply because they are important, but when the two regional governments try to settle down the issues by their own mechanisms, it was somehow challenging. And then they give them a kind of de facto recognition if they could able to manage the relationship between the two communities, because the two communities have totally different kind of cultural and the communal kind of relationship. So, of course, it matters.
In terms of other examples that might be useful in relation to this question, I think in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and certain West African countries, customary authorities have been given formal statutory roles on the very local level when people might be going to state court to regulate certain disputes or at least route them through the broader system that is less reliant on traditional authority as you move up. So maybe that's an interesting example or set of examples for folks to look at on filling this gap. And how different traditional justice institutions might affiliate with state agencies. I think another really apropos example is from Niger, where historically, after colonialism, Niger kept some of these formal roles or created some formal roles for customary authorities. So there's always been, relative to Mali, for example, more of a formalistic role in some ways for the traditional authorities in Niger. And, I think with the jihadist insurgencies that are touching the Sahel nowadays, with displacement, with armed actors sort of threatening people in communities, chiefs themselves, even though they are these political authorities in some way or appendages of the state to some extent, are also themselves threatened. They're seen by some as, agents of the state. They're seen by others maybe as, the armed groups are also sort of seeing them as a threat. And so I think there are different ways on both ends. I think there's some interesting research from Klingendel Institute that came out recently talking about how chiefs in Niger are between a rock and a hard place in terms of how the armed groups deal with them and how they deal with armed groups in their localities, but also this potential affiliation with the state on the other end of things. So I think it's a very difficult political calculus, especially in an insurgency context as well.
Should we get to the second question?
Yes.
About where traditional mechanisms have worked with more formal mechanisms?
Yes.
I mean, just because, this is all first of all, the international courts are fairly new. So this isn't something that this is something that's still developing, and we're going to keep seeing new examples and places where countries will have an opportunity to create their own models. But I think one example where this maybe has worked best so far is Sierra Leone, where they did have, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which was a hybrid court. They had a truth commission that did explicitly allow and include that included traditional civil society and religious leaders in truth-seeking and reconciliation sessions. There also, in Sierra Leone, there were ceremonies and rituals for things that allowed for, the reintegration of former child soldiers, which is something that is a very delicate topic. I don't think it's something that courts are particularly well placed to do, that kind of very delicate reintegration of people who are both perpetrators and victims. And so I think that's, one example, to date where it's been somewhat successful and maybe a lesson in how you can have multiple institutions that are tackling the problem of justice in a holistic way.
Okay. Well, thank you. Now I have two more batches of 3 questions each. Number one, as traditional justice institutions often address context-specific dynamics, including those related to ethnicity or religion, what are the challenges to applying lessons learned across very different contexts? And what are your recommendations to ensure that the inclusion of traditional justice institutions empowers and includes women or other marginalized groups? And then number 3, there has been a lot of discussion and research on traditional justice and peace in Afghanistan. Are there any lessons, either positive or negative, to be learned from this specific case?
Well, maybe I can take a stab at the first one,
Sure.
which is how do you, given that this is context specific, how do you apply lessons? And I think the answer is that the only way to do it is through broad consultations that are inclusive, that include, women, marginalized communities, those who are victims. I think, that's one of the things that we really try and emphasize, because people in their own situations will know a lot about what mechanisms they trust and where it's appropriate. And sometimes that changes over time, like during the conflict where, and at the beginning of the conflict, they may have said, we would like to see traditional justice mechanisms work here. And later on, they're like, no, this is no longer, sometimes conflict can mean that customary courts ended up being co-opted or brought into the larger conflict. So then no longer are seen to be as trustworthy. Or in South Sudan, in conversations about transitional justice, people have said, well, if a lot of the violence is coming from state forces, we know that we're not going to be able to take the military, the government forces into a traditional system. So I think people in the context, they know the dynamics and they understand that. And I think the best thing to do is to really try and work to foster broad dialogues that are inclusive. It's very hard. Often it's the easiest thing to do is to have these dialogues in capitals rather than reaching out, across the country, getting people who are internally displaced or refugees in other countries. So it's really hard. And people don't always understand, what are the options available. So there's a big education component to telling people, listen, here's all of your options. Like, let's think about it. Here's all of the ways that you might want to deal with the situation. I think people have, at least in some contexts, they express a lot of interest in South-to-South collaboration. They want to learn from what other people have done to think about what would work best here. Can we take any lessons learned? So I think it's really just a process of engagement, dialogue, discussion, and education.
And then the other 2 questions, I don't know if there any of you have any expertise on Afghanistan, and then this interest in making sure that women's groups or other marginalized groups are included when you include traditional justice institutions as a part of peace building.
I'm not quite sure somehow, but in relation to the how the local context and somehow related to the Afghanistan part, I can't say specific kind of response to that. But what I can say is that we need to know what kind of traditional institutions are there in Afghanistan, and how the local communities perceive in relation to such traditions. So the specific case in the Gereb part may not be applicable to somewhere. But what matters is how the local communities perceive the conflict, whether they want to engage traditional institutions or they want to go through formal kinds of institutions. So we need to be more context specific in such kinds of situations. And the women in other marginalized kind of group, of course, that's one limitations of somehow traditional justice institutions. That's something that we should work on, and in collaboration with different kind of international actors, in order to engage the marginalized and other groups in traditional justice institutions.
Yeah, I can add on if you would like. I too don't admit I don't know a great deal about the specifics of the Afghanistan situation to be able to comment probably in the way the person who asked that question would like. And I think that is one of the challenges of applying lessons learned across contexts, like you were saying. I think really knowing the local context and then knowing citizens, if possible, either through an INL survey like Jana mentioned or otherwise, knowing for which kinds of problems or issues citizens prefer to go to different justice forums. Who do they trust the most with different kinds of problems, financial, land-related, rape, murder. There are a variety of things on a spectrum that one might resort to the justice system to deal with. And so I think knowing some of those basics before you move in to do an intervention or to figure out some of these thornier questions we've been talking about how formal and informal institutions relate and customary and state-related institutions relate. That's a really important piece of it. I think in terms of inclusion of women, I had mentioned in my recommendations taking a deeper look maybe at some African examples of how this legal empowerment model of looking at rule of law and justice, including in post-conflict contexts, I think that could help address some of these questions about women and youth and their exclusion, in a lot of these traditional systems in terms of being the leaders of the conflict resolution process and all of that. And so I think if you look in countries like CAR and DRC or Liberia and Sierra Leone, we've seen maybe a more holistic approach that has involved international donors, some international actors, but also very localized community members who have either paralegal skills or legal skills in their communities coming together, often through local civil society groups. And I think if we take a community paralegal approach to informing citizens about what their different justice options are, to include traditional justice institutions, but also to include maybe the state court options insofar as they exist, offering to accompany people through some of these processes. Particularly, I think that's helped in relation to state court options that people have, but also giving just people legal information about what, if they want to go to any part of the justice system to resolve an issue that they're having, what are their options and what are the strengths and weaknesses and what are the workings of those institutions. That is one way to address women, potential users of the justice system, in a way that, in theory at least, is empowering them to make a choice about, obviously, your traditional institutions are very close to you in your community. They're cheap, they're accessible. There may be a social expectation for you to take your problem, regardless of what it is, to those institutions, and they aren't always necessarily the best fit for everyone. From a international human rights perspective, but then also giving other elements of information about how other aspects of the justice system might work is a way to at least holistically bring women and youth into understanding the broader systemic dynamics. And then they can make more informed choices given their social constraints, given the community expectations, given the resources that they have. Sometimes these legal aid clinics, which work by bringing paralegals from their communities to go out and do this legal information sharing with people that they know. If you can work through that, I think you can instruct people on some of the different options they have, and maybe that helps at least inform choices, even if we do have sort of constraints and benefits of using the different institutions in relation to exclusion. So we've seen this in Liberia and Sierra Leone. I think this community paralegal model of legal information that has then gotten a lot of funding internationally started with a local organization called TMAP for Justice, which was actually, I think, an alliance between the Open Society Foundation and the Sierra Leone National Human Rights Coalition of NGOs. But it's a model that's been developed further by NAMATI, which is a more international organization. They do global legal work all over the world. ABA Rowley, the American Bar Association, has adopted a similar model to legal aid and legal service provision in Central African Republic. So they work with local community paralegals, but also local lawyers. And so depending on choices that people make, women or men, boys or girls, about the justice option they want to seek, there are different ways that people can give guidance on how to approach strategically whatever situation you're facing. So I don't know if that's a super satisfying answer, but maybe that also gets at this question we had earlier about successful collaborations and examples of international institutions working with local ones.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to ask the audience again, any questions? It looks like we have one in the first row of audience members. Yeah. We have a microphone coming to you.
First of all, I just want to thank the panelists for the great information provided. I just had one question.
Oh, could you state your name and your affiliation?
My name is Brian Karamuka. I work with NDI. I was wondering what the panelists' thoughts are in regards to if there's value in establishing a specific sort of traditional justice institution that has a clear mandate. especially in cases where there's been some kind of traumatic experiences with conflict, such as maybe South Sudan, as was mentioned, Rwanda with the genocide, and the establishment of the Chacha courts. And so I was wondering if the panelists think there's value in establishing sort of these institutions that have a clear mandate, or is it better to just have sort of a more long-term approach and systematic approach? And if there's a conflict in that area, then maybe there can be some kind of integration into that already existing system. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think I would say that, so say like you have a conflict and then you're thinking, what institutions do we need? Rather than saying from, sort of, let's establish one institution to do traditional justice or to coordinate traditional justice responses. I think you really just, instead, I would say it's probably better to have a more broad transitional justice plan that you put together after broad national consultations and dialogue, where you do the research and you think about, again, like what institutions do you think you'll need? What kind of reparations are people looking for? Do we think that, how will this look together? So I think it's more useful at the start to have the discussion and dialogue and then put together sort of a map on how you might approach it, rather than say at the outset, we will definitely have an institution that will deal with traditional justice. I think it's better to be more flexible and at the outset. And I think you see some of this in like peace agreements, like the recent Juba peace agreement in Sudan. Now, obviously the situation in Sudan has gotten more complicated since October 25th. But in the Juba peace agreement, you do start thinking through, like, here's the kinds of issues that we're going to need to address. We're going to need to address human rights. We're going to need to address land reform. We're going to need to address, the atrocities committed in Darfur. And so it's just a plan and they have we'll establish a human rights commission, a transitional justice commission. So I think, setting up some ideas for people who will deal with it down the road is good. You can sort of create a map and say, we know we have to deal with these problems. We're going to create some institutions that will help us do that without necessarily, I don't think there's a need to be so concrete to be we will, these are, to lay out in a peace agreement, here's all of the things that we will absolutely form. So that's what I would say, more consultation and maybe a map and sort of to eventually feed into a transitional justice policy.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
First of all, Elham Atashi, Georgetown University, co-director of the Justice and Peace Studies program. My question is twofold. One is, has there ever been any studies done based on the broad consultation that some of you mentioned, that where the victim-centered traditional restorative practices have not met the needs of the victims? And as a result of that, has there been any measures of what next? Because I think each of you have mentioned this very significant role of consultation with the local population. But I was just wondering, has there ever been a study done with victims as a result of these broad consultations where the victims are no, these traditional methods are not going to work for us and we would like something else? And when they said they would like something else, what that something else looked like, and if we know anything about that. And then I think my second question is also related to that, in that I think you had mentioned that traditional justice mechanisms are often focused on resolution rather than prevention. Has there ever again been, or is there any data available of, as a result of a justice mechanisms that's been traditional, where grievances and historical injustices have not been addressed, they have actually been the cause of conflict and future conflicts rather than being preventative? I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
I just wanted to get a clarification. You said that you felt you had heard from the panel that...
Yeah, yeah, I would say a few things.
Yeah, I think I heard you say that much focus has been given to resolution of when it comes to traditional mechanisms, but not on prevention. And I think one of your recommendations was to focus more on this preventative role. And I think, just to be clear, I'm asking, has there ever been, or are you aware of any studies where, because and as a result of traditional mechanisms that have been enforced, grievances that were not addressed ended up being the cause of future conflicts, or led to triggering of future conflicts because of lack of justice as a result of some informal mechanisms that have been traditional?
Okay. On this specific question, I would say a few things. Of course, I'm not just taking any other kind of research, but I try to compare the situations in the Gereb traditional kinds of justice institutions. The Gereb traditional justice institutions have tried to settle down historical conflicts in 2006 or 2007 within the community. Compensation are already ordered for historical, meaning different kinds of conflict in different regions. So they have ordered compensation, and there were the kind of reconciliations between the two communities. So after 2006, till this year conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia, there was no major conflict between those two communities, which was in some historic days, it was somehow conflict-prone area or center of conflict of or intercommunal or inter-ethnic kind of conflict. So my reference is that for the last 10, 15 years, there was no serious kind of conflict between those two communities because of the role of the traditional institutions in cooperation, in collaboration with other state kind of institutions. It's not simply, or I don't want to romanticize traditional institutions are the sole actors in such kind of situations. You know, the government supports them, and there is collaboration between the state institution and traditional kinds of institutions. But what I want to make here is that such kind of conflict does not re-emerge even after 10 or 15 years. That's how conflict prevention needs to be considered in such situations. I don't know if there is any other research in relation to conflict prevention in traditional justice institutions. Thank you.
I could step in and try to address maybe parts of both of the questions that you posed. I think in terms of prevention, I don't know that there's a study that's explicitly able to prove the counterfactual that you're talking about here, but I think the studies that have caught my eye on this, I've alluded to in the initial presentation, come from the Rift Valley region and from Eastern Africa, where cattle rustling and livestock theft really have been perennial issues that are potential sparks of bigger conflicts, if not addressed sort of on the local level between different tribes and clans that are involved in this. This is a cultural practice, but it's also something that more recently we've seen having some serious conflict-related implications and maybe even organized criminal kinds of implications in some cases. And I know East African chiefs of police are worried about this. I think a variety of different stakeholders in the different East African states where this is a practice are thinking about this a lot. And so I think there are local peacebuilding committees in Kenya, I think in some of the other neighboring countries that have tried to bring in traditional leaders precisely because of this idea that dealing with these issues when they're potentially smaller issues, more localized issues, could play this preventive role that Awit is talking about us needing to emphasize a little bit more. And I would say in terms of, on the more academic side, if you look at the Civil War literature on, conflict, if we look at Stathis Kalivas's work on how local dynamics of conflict can percolate or play into sort of broader national level sort of issues, you can see how, at least a theory of how being preventative through traditional justice institutions could help address some of these cyclical dynamics that we see in a lot of places where we have conflict or post-conflict or this fine line to draw, as Jana was saying. In terms of restorative processes not meeting needs of victims, what would the alternative look like? The closest I can get to you with empirical information is I used to do some work with the American Bar Association's Legal Empowerment Program in Central African Republic. And one of the things we were able to do with funding from INL at the State Department was take a survey of Bangui residents at a key point in the conflict and get their sense of different preferences and levels of trust that they actually and hypothetically had in terms of different actors who could be providing justice. For different kinds of problems you're facing, who would you go to? And you could answer nobody, but you could also answer, oh, well, for a rape case, I would go to the police or I would go to the courts. And indeed, for more criminal matters, among the urban residents in that part of Bangui, there was this idea that, well, in terms of justice solutions on murder, on assault, on rape issues, that many of which relate to the conflict, they would prefer to go, if they were going anywhere, to the national court system or the police. And that's an interesting finding because the police system was under reconstruction. The justice system is under reconstruction at the time. This was 2017-ish. But for financial, family-related issues, et cetera, land-related issues, certainly customary authorities or local leaders of various sorts were much more trusted. And so I think breaking down what the alternative would look like requires going into these different kinds of situations people might find themselves in, and then figuring out also the generalized level of trust in anyone but your family or your neighbor. It was really low in Bangui at that time, and so I think in terms of restorative processes not working and what the alternative is, it's a tough question to answer because sometimes there's not a lot of trust in any institutions as well. That's the car example. I'm sure it's different in other places, but just an idea there.
Okay. Well, we have 3 more questions, or 2 more questions, and we have 10 minutes left. Oh, and we have one more from the audience. Sorry, Sandra. Yeah.
Sandra Tumesije, I'm an SVNP scholar with the Africa program. So my question is in relation to the situation where women and girls who have experienced gender-specific harms during the conflict are not able to get justice from traditional mechanisms, traditional institutions that are patriarchal, that usually further the abuses. But on the other side, where the formal actors, like in the example you gave, were also perpetrators and therefore not as committed to processes that would require truth and that kind of justice. If there are examples from different contexts where actors have been able to bypass this and still deliver justice for women and girls.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a really good question, and I think it's something that we're still trying to grapple with. Particularly, like I said, like in a country like South Sudan, where there's the traditional mechanisms really may not really recognize the harms done to victims themselves and deal with them appropriately. And a lot of the violence is coming from the state. I think, it's something that we're really working on. There is a new court that deals with sexual and gender-based violence in Juba. That's just for one, that's just for the capital. That really does leave a gap for everyone else. And that's hard. And there's some other attempts. The UN mission has been working on mobile courts with the domestic authorities to try and send judges and lawyers out to different parts of the country to try and deliver justice outside of the capital. That seems to be really successful and helpful. But I think it's a long-term project. I think it's something that we have to keep working on because sexual violence is one of the hallmarks of the conflict in South Sudan, and women and girls are by far the primary victims of that violence. So I think trying to figure out how do you do justice to those victims and how do you restore them is going to be one of the biggest challenges that we face.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say in terms of mobile courts, that was going to be part of my answer too. So it's good to hear that from the Sudanese context. I'm thinking about it in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo sort of conflict context. Mobile courts have made a big difference in terms of linking victims of sexual and gender-based violence from past conflicts to usually the formal justice system, the provincial courts. But having mobile courts allows more mobility for people who are far from those courts. I mean, I think statutory justice systems sort of downsides are that they're often expensive for people who would want to be litigants or who would consider being litigants. They're maybe far away from where many victims of this kind of violence are located. And so making them mobile helps. Linking up the mobile courts with international donors, with the national government as well, allows fees to be paid, sometimes for litigants who want justice for this specific kind of thing. And often, going to the state court system to deal with rape or sexual related violence is something that may in some cases work better than trying to work through a traditional justice system to deal with this, although again, there's social pressures to present your case in different places that could have other consequences that influence people's decisions. So I think that's challenging, but I think again, in terms of a legal empowerment approach where this is available and you can offer people transparent information about what would happen and how long would it take. It also takes a very long time for the formal system, even if someone wants to file a complaint in the state system related to SGBV, for that to fully process. And so having some legal accompaniment and explanation and support throughout that process it can help. And I think the other question is, even when you're given legal knowledge that you have this option, under what conditions are people going to be able to accept or to want to try that in a way that they think will help them? I think in Central African Republic, in the legal aid clinic I was speaking about there, in that network, information is often provided about different options, but very often formal courts are where, the state courts are where people go, the criminal court, to deal with SGBV issues. And so, again, even in a system that was really, really under construction in Central African Republic, there was a surprising amount, I thought, as an analyst of this, of demand for that kind of option. And legal empowerment can certainly help with that, but certainly not solve this big issue. I also think in terms of traditional system and customary norms, there's also been interesting work that's been done on the hair customary body of knowledge and procedures in Somalia that's often mixed on the local level with local interpretations of Sharia law. And so I think there have also been interesting projects that have been done on feminist interpretations of Sharia in relation to the customary system, and trying to push for, under certain political conditions, an evolving or adapting way of thinking about some of these issues from a more feminist or gender-sensitive, gender-analytic perspective. So that's what I can say about this really challenging issue.
We've had such a rich array of questions, and these two last ones I'd just like to throw out. And we really don't have much time to address them, but I thought they were such good questions. I don't want to ignore them. So one is, have you seen any examples of direct collaboration between different traditional justice institutions in different regions or countries where they shared lessons learned or best practices directly with one another? And then the second question is, what are some successful examples of traditional justice institutions adapting to incorporate international human rights principles or law? And on the other hand, how do they contribute to the development of international human rights frameworks? So I appreciate your concise responses.
Well, maybe just to take a little bit off the last one. I mean, I think one of the things that we maybe are learning from traditional mechanisms is the importance of reparations and the importance of prioritizing, not just reparations, but also psychosocial support for victims and witnesses. And I think the international courts are getting better at thinking about how do you, one, about providing reparations. So there is a trust fund for victims at the ICC, and I think, thinking about how do you provide for victims while they're seeking justice is an important development. As well as thinking, what other needs do victims have, in the court process, which is that they may be dealing with multiple forms of trauma. And so I think courts are, the traditional, institutions, the formal court institutions are getting better at sort of, I think, looking at victims more holistically and thinking about their needs more holistically. So I think that's one of the better evolutions of the international justice movement.
Not to give a hot take right at the end, but I think adapting international human rights principles entirely to the customary system, there's always going to be some space. There's always going to be some ambiguity in exactly how much the twain can meet, but it's a worthy endeavor. It's a very hard thing to fully reconcile, and it depends on the local context exactly how that's going to happen.
Well, I just can't thank you enough for all that you have raised and elucidated on the topic of traditional justice institutions. I very much like Dr. Kelly's phrase, ecosystem of justice-seeking institutions and approaches, and the way that Awit informed us of how traditional justice institutions can with their victim-centered approach, offer a lot to that ecosystem. I also was so pleased to hear about State Department's efforts in this area. I've been really proud to work with people from INL Bureau and also from your office, the Global Criminal Justice Office, which is doing so much to educate the rest of the State Department about the importance of this work. So for me, this panel has really made clear that the importance of supporting more research and scholarship, such as what AWID is doing on traditional justice institutions and their role in peace building. So I thank you all, and I thank our audience for their question prompts. And unfortunately, we've run out of time for the discussion today, but I hope people will come back next week for our last Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Scholar event on Tuesday, April 5th from 9 to 10:30 a.m. We will be hosting an event, a discussion on refugee women's inclusion in peace agreements and peace building in Africa, challenges and opportunities. You can get more information from the Africa Program website. So please join me in thanking our speakers, and thank you all for joining us today.